When it comes to writing advice, getting rid of your passive voice is right up there with show don't tell and get a real job. This is a really important piece of advice, which is probably the reason it's such a common piece of advice. So let's talk about what the passive voice is, why it's usually but not always a problem, and some of the ways that you can fix your passive voice. Or rather, some of the ways your passive voice can be fixed by you. First, let's take a look at what passive voice actually is. And in order to do that, we're going to have to take a look at sentence structure and grammar. Sorry, please don't stop watching the video. Most sentences are composed of at least three components. You have the verb, which is the action that is occurring in the scene. You have the subject or actor, which is the thing, either personified or not, who is doing the action. And you have the object, or I've also seen the term patient used, which is the thing that the action is happening to. There are also other parts like adverbs and adjectives and conjunctions and a bunch of other stuff I don't remember from elementary school English. Anyway, a sentence is said to be active if the subject is described as the entity performing the action or the verb. The mad scientist placed the cat inside the particle accelerator is an active sentence because the subject is performing the action. The mad scientist is the entity performing the action, so that makes them the subject, and the cat is the entity that the action is happening to, so that makes them the object. A sentence becomes passive when you instead describe what is happening to the object. The cat was placed in the particle accelerator by the mad scientist is inherently passive because we are now observing the object instead of the subject. And that's essentially all that the passive versus active voice situation describes. Inverting the subject-object relationship in the sentence typically results in that sentence being in the passive voice. There's some other nuance here, but this is short-form internet content, so we tend to just ignore nuance, if we even mention it at all. There are also some things that I've seen lumped in with passive versus active voice, or things that are considered to be the same thing as active versus passive voice. So for that, just assume anything I don't mention here, like show don't tell and verb tense, have nothing to do with passive voice. Oh crap, I just mentioned those. Now, there is nothing grammatically wrong with passive voice. Both the passive and active versions of the sentence we just talked about are grammatically correct, and I would say that in this case they are both equally comprehensible. The main problem with passive voice is one of engagement and flow. Because passive voice describes something happening to something else by something else, it tends to be less vivid and usually less interesting. Stories are about people doing stuff, or elves, or robots, or something else doing stuff. So it's best to show those things happening from the perspective of the people doing them, or the elves, or the robots, or whatever. Passive voice is less direct and tends to make the action feel like it's farther away. It slows the pacing of the story down, and it's kind of strange, but passive voice, even though it feels slower, will make the events of the story seem to go by faster. They will seem more summarized. Passive voice can also mess with the flow of a piece. It does this in a couple of different ways. For one thing, it tends to take more words. The active version of the example I gave earlier took 10 words, whereas the passive version took 12 words. Your reader will also have a tendency to expect active voice. The first noun that they encounter in a sentence will be assumed to be the subject and not the object. So when the sentence turns out to be passive, this can lead to a moment when the reader has to sort of play catch up. Long stretches of all passive voice can cause reader comprehension issues. They won't be sure what they should be following, and it will draw them out of the story. Now, that being said, there are times when the passive voice makes sense. Or rather, times when sense was made by the passive voice. The last sentence wasn't one of them. When the subject of a sentence is unknown or unimportant, it can be omitted by using passive voice. The cat was placed in the particle accelerator, which is why he's not here. He's in the particle accelerator. That sentence is passive with the subject eliminated, and that would be the way that you would write that if you didn't know who put the cat in the particle accelerator. Someone or something placed the cat in the particle accelerator is active and with a subject that is unknown. When you have a passive sentence where the subject is unknown, it becomes a simple statement of fact. When you have the active version with an unknown subject, it kind of takes on a foreboding or an accusatory tone. Depending on what it is you want to convey, using passive voice might make more sense in this situation. This is why a lot of scientific writing tends to rely on the passive voice. If you're writing something like a methodology, you care less about who's doing the actions and more about what actions are happening and what they're happening to. In fact, if you're writing a scientific methodology, writing in active voice is actively discouraged because you don't want sentences like, I placed the cat in the particle accelerator and then I set the gauge up to 11 and plus. The other time when you should use passive voice is when it sounds better. I know that that's not very helpful, but hear me out. If you are revising a sentence and you recognize that it's passive and you try to convert it into active voice and it doesn't read as well or isn't as clear, then go ahead and keep it as passive. While passive voice can do things like slow your pace and disengage the reader and make the action seem more summarized, there are times when you'd want to do all of those things, and there are times when the passive construct of a sentence is much better than the alternative. Both passive and active voice are grammatically correct. It just so happens to be that active voice is usually the preferred way to present information in fiction. So any good piece of fiction is going to be mostly written in active voice while using passive voice where it fits best. So the general advice that you should switch everything to active is still good advice, but if something works better in passive voice, or it's easier to understand, or you just like it better, then don't worry about keeping it in passive. So how can you find and fix your passive voice? Or rather, how can your passive voice be found and fixed by you? Well, the first step is to identify. You can usually find passive voice by looking for auxiliary verbs. These are verbs added to another verb to help construct the passive voice, among other things. I told you I forget most of my elementary school English. Is, was, were, had, will be, and the like are all auxiliary verbs. There's others, but those are the major ones. Now, just having one of these verbs doesn't automatically make a sentence passive. So if you've seen advice like cutting out all your was's, or if one of your critique partners is highlighting every was in your manuscript and saying that it's passive, they are right probably some of the time, but not all of the time. Of course, the best way to determine if something is passive is to ask yourself if the subject and object are swapped. Swapping the object for the subject and removing the auxiliary verb is usually most of what you need to do in order to make something active from something that was passive. Again, don't do this if it messes up the sentence, as we talked about before, but if you have a tendency to write a lot of things in the passive voice, you would probably benefit from switching most of it to active. Or by switching most of it to active, you would benefit. See what I mean? Just like you benefited by this video now being over. Well, that sounded bad. Just like you benefited from watching this video, I hope. There we go. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Several of the other videos have more cat in them. He was decidedly uncooperative today, but I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I don't usually have to record the outro that many times. That was like 6 times. I don't know why. I kept screwing up.